Hi, my name is John Fortner, and this is my video report for Lab 5, Magnetic Braking with Faraday. Lab 5, Magnetic Braking with Faraday, investigates the motion of a bar magnet falling through a conductive tube. The magnet is slowed in its fall by an oppositely oriented magnetic field, produced by the effect of Faraday's law on the tube. So the lab relies on the formula for a magnetic field produced by a magnetic dipole, as well as formulas describing the effect of Faraday's law on the metal tube and the magnetic field the tube produces as a result. Finally, the lab relies on Newton's third law, which states that every force has an equal and opposite force. In this case, the magnetic force exerted by the bar magnet on the tube results in an opposite force exerted on the magnet. So in this lab, we observe the time it takes for a bar magnet to fall straight down through a tube made of aluminum foil. We conduct 5 trials and take our result as the average result of those trials. And then we compare that experimental result with the result produced by a computational model in Google Script. So this Excel sheet shows the data from the lab. So this column here is the actual result from the experiment of the 5 trials. So each time we found 0.9 seconds as the time it took to fall for 4 of the trials, and then 1 second for the last trial. And then this box is the average, which was 0.92 seconds. And then these values are in meters, the length of the tube, the thickness of the foil around the tube, and the inner radius of the tube, which is the radius within the actual foil. So the computational model works by modeling the foil tube as a series of rings, and then uses a loop to calculate the magnetic force from the falling magnet on each of the rings. And then using the principle of Newton's third law, that also is a calculation for the opposing force from each ring on the magnet. And then the model calculates the net force on the falling magnet, which is the magnetic force on the magnet from the tube, plus the gravitational force on the magnet, and then it models the motion of the magnet accordingly. So this is the code for the lab, so we'll go ahead and run the model. And as we see, the magnet descends through the tube. So this graph of velocity shows how the magnet at first is accelerating due to gravity, and then due to the opposing force of the magnetic field from the tube, it reaches a terminal velocity, and then stays at that velocity throughout its descent through the tube. So this is in effect the same as a drag force. It's just caused by a magnetic force rather than the force of air resistance. And then we see that the time in the tube was 0.959 seconds. So our computational model's calculation for the falling time was 0.959 seconds, compared with our experimental calculation of 0.92 seconds. So the computational model time is slightly greater. However, they're actually very close. This is a very reasonable amount of error, especially given that the model is based on very precise measurements of the width and length of the tube. So very small differences in the amount of foil around the tube would have made a big difference in the amount of time it took for the magnet to descend. So finally, some additional questions. First, what if the resistivity of the conductor were reduced as close as possible to 0? How would the dynamics of the falling magnet change? So a small resistivity would result in a very small amount of resistance in the conductor, which would allow the propagation of a much larger current. And the presence of a larger induced current in the tube would lead to a greater magnetic force on the magnet, which would slow its descent even more than we observed in the experiment. And what if holes or slots were cut into the tube? How would this affect the ring currents in your model? So in an actual experiment, cutting holes in the tube would somewhat decrease the magnetic force acting on the magnet, but it would not be as significant a change as we would observe in the model, because current could still flow through the tube, sort of going around the holes. But in the computational model, because the tube is modeled as a series of rings, putting a hole in the side of the tube would make some of those rings discontinuous. If there's any separation in one of the rings, there will be no current flowing through that ring. So if a hole were cut into the tube in the model, then the rings would have no current and therefore would have no magnetic force acting back on the magnet. So this would significantly reduce the magnetic force acting on the magnet in our computational model. And that's all. Thank you very much for watching.